All right, welcome back everyone from the breakout rooms.
That was abrupt, George.
Thank you, George. We'd already done it all, so we were ready to come back.
Well, there you go. I gave you some warnings.
Yeah, no, I appreciated the 1 minute warning because I've been in other breakout sessions where you have no idea and it just cuts out and you're like, what the heck happened? Yeah, so that was great. Thank you.
All right, well, I wish I could have been in all those rooms to hear the discussions. But next best thing is to get the lowdown from reports out from each group. So I think we're ready to dive right in. And so I'll just go through the breakout rooms in order and just unmute. And if you're the reporter, just unmute yourself and jump right in. So we'll start off with the biological carbon pump group.
Hey, I'm Isabel Giddy. I'll be reporting for our group. We had a pretty interesting discussion that talked about different methods and the issue of temporal and spatial scales that the floats measure. So I think the first interesting point we talked about was touching on quantifying carbon flux and whether using biooptics or the geochemical sensors would give you a more quantitative value. And I think our conclusion was that both are useful, but provide different scales of variance. And as more floats are available, we will be able to combine the different multiple estimates to get a fuller picture of the processes. Another method we spoke about was the issue of quantifying particle density, which at the moment is perhaps not possible, but with floats that are equipped with an optical beam attenuation, which as a sensor I'm not familiar with, so maybe someone else could jump in and talk about that. But I think that would be a way to quantify particle density. And we spoke about quantifying sinking rates, which is used for estimating particle flux. And currently Nathan Briggs's particle flux method requires high frequency observations to estimate a sinking rate. And so we mentioned other methods which could supplement the calculations, such as sediment traps, as well as another method, which I think is also requires a beam attenuation sensor. Seemed pretty interesting. Not familiar with it. And I think Nathan shared a paper about it, perhaps.
That's the optical sediment trap method. I didn't share that paper, but I'll add it to the document.
Cool. And then I think the final big point we spoke about was the temporal and spatial scales or the issue of thinking about what are the floats actually seeing and what information are you capturing, because the float's obviously moving around in space and time. And I think it was just a point to think about and reflect on when interpreting the data. And I think we all agreed that having more than one float increased one's confidence in answering questions when assessing a region. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in and add points that I might have missed. Another big one was that the floats by themselves are great, but generally our questions require multiple data sources, the addition of shipboard measurements and satellites, higher high frequency measurements, perhaps gliders and other methods. Yeah. Thank
All right,
you.
thank you for that summary. I think in order to keep on pace, we will move on to the second group on climate change impacts.
Hi there. Yeah. Yep. So our group was the Climate Change Impacts group, and it was led by Sarah Perkey. And there are kind of three main points from our conversation that I'm just going to sum up. One, which was the point made that, of course, to look at climate change, you need to have comprehensive funding that is long lasting. And so you can have a sustained observing program. And so it was just an important reminder that a lot of the current funding for the BGC Argo program is based on shorter term funding cycles. And so it's important to remember, especially in the communication, that we're kind of really making sure that we're looking for this long-term sustained funding for this important observing program moving into the future. And then after that, we also had kind of these 2 points that we discussed, which were more applications relating to BGC Argo floats and within the realm of climate change. One was related to geoengineering solutions, actually. And so we had Salvador as part of our group, who works for a company called Ocean-Based Climate Solutions. And so they're developing artificial autonomous upwelling pumps that use wave energy. And so they're interested in making sure that they can document how much CO2 is actually sequestered and exported. They're basically trying to pump water from 500 meters up to the surface and simulate phytoplankton growth. And so they're trying to think about how you can use BGC Argo floats to actually measure drawdown, because then you would basically deploy these floats with their array of kind of floating upwelling pumps. And the kind of the funding for this would actually be provided by corporations that would be getting basically carbon credits for this type of drawdown. And we discussed that there are concerns relating to that include outgassing of CO2 at the surface, as well as deoxygenation and acidification impacts in midwater and deeper regions below where this artificial upwelling is taking place. And then lastly, we also talked about applications of BGC Argo data to validating CMIP6 model outputs. And so I guess here the point was that there are issues with kind of the 3D structure of data from the CMIP6 model outputs. And so being able to check the interpolation and extrapolations correctly and validate these for that BGC Argo data should be a really key component. And so, yeah, I guess then there was one last point made that the BGC Argo program is always looking to work more closely with modelers as well, climate modelers, to make sure that these data are getting used to validate climate model outputs. So I think if there's anyone else in the group that would like to add something if I missed anything. Yeah.
All right, that sounds great. Let's see, cruise planning. Lynn, was anyone willing to dive into the nitty-gritty of making this all possible?
Nope, Steve Diggs stopped by to say hi. So I am the reporter, moderator, and etc. So I'll be extremely brief. What I would like to talk about over time, maybe over the rest of the summer and into the fall, is the observing system design part of that. I guess people not joining means that they're pretty sure we're putting the floats where they should be. But I think that all of these breakout groups will have conclusions and things and people involved who could help with prioritizing which fields we're sampling for, rather than just assuming, so that as we build the array globally, that we're making informed choices and in maintaining it over time. So that's all. I guess we have nitty gritty of getting on ships and so forth, and that didn't really need to be discussed. So thanks.
Any questions for Lynn about deployments, what's on the horizon, or how those decisions get made? All right, well, we hope to to continue to hear input on how we can prioritize where the floats go. And once they're in, the next topic is data access and data management.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Rue. I'll give a summary, and thank you to Josh for helping to organize that breakout room. We had 10 participants, and it was a mix of folks, Josh and myself, and other people who are quite familiar with manipulating the data, other data managers and folks that have performed DMQC on floats, as well as new users, and we also had some industry representation there. And Martini from Seabirds. Yeah, we discussed a number of points. I think a lot of, well, the new users were expressing interest in, finding out better ways to access the data. So the tutorial will be a great asset there. And then a lot of us were just interested in general in how people are accessing the data currently. So we had a bit of discussion there. There's a lot of people are very receptive to the Argo NetCDF format and the SPROF files, so that was good to hear. Steve Diggs joined momentarily and gave a good plug for ArgoViz for data selection. That's a tool that I didn't discuss at all in the talk yesterday, so we'll want to be sure people are aware of that. We also spent some time discussing the derived carbon parameters that we serve through the MBARI pathway. And it sounds like, folks want to see us continue to serve those products. But we also discussed eventually, providing those tools for users to be able to compute those parameters on their own. And there was a lot of interest there too. And in doing both, maintaining both services, especially as we're just beginning to develop and disseminate tools so people can cross-check their work with what we've provided. There was also some discussion of Pangeo and getting the data into that, just to have everything, different data from different sources that people are using all in the same location. I don't have much familiarity with Pangeo, but there was a bit of discussion there. And then that kind of jumped us into discussion of the shipboard data reference database. That's something that's been under discussion within the BGC Argo community, just finding a better way to centralize across data assembly centers the shipboard data that gets collected alongside deployment. And Siv mentioned, as a representative of the GO-BGC community, that there's a comment paper coming out in Nature, kind of describing the future vision of GO-BGC and how to better automate the flow of data into GO-BGC for BGC in a more resilient way. So look for that. And then she also offered an interesting idea. We sort of need a third GDAC, or an ocean carbon GDAC, for kind of centralizing some of these derived products and tools and reference data. But of course, there's quite a bit of funding that would be needed to support that. And then a lot of interest in more centralized code repositories. There's some pre-existing codes that exist and can be accessed through Argo for specific things, but sort of more centralized code repositories for beginners was of interest. And again, the data access tutorial tomorrow will help push that a bit forward. So I guess that's it, unless I'm grossly neglecting to mention anything or I misspoke on any of those points. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. Any questions or comments for data access and management group?
Tanya, maybe not a third DAC, maybe a regional Argo regional center kind of thing for carbon equivalent.
Yeah. Something to move that forward, but yeah, I think the bottom line is there's some funding that needs to happen.
I think there's a huge range of potential products that the community could start to generate using GO-BGC data. All right, so let's move on to float technology and sensors.
Great. Okay. So in our breakout room, so we talked about kind of float technology and the sensor technology somewhat separately. So some improvements that we thought that would be helpful in the float technology itself was one, which is power. Like just the more power we have, the more sensors we can put on it. So a couple suggestions were to keep a close track of battery technology improvements. So if someone knows Elon Musk personally, let us know so we can go, butter him up. But also, there are some ocean energy harvesting technologies out there. These are still emerging, and they're limited both geographically and price-wise, but something to keep an eye out for the future. Data transmission could become a problem in the future with more sensors and more data to transmit. Ceridian next. So people have looked into that a little bit, but there's a trade-off in terms of size of the antenna and the energy budget for that currently. So there's a trade-off there as well. We discussed biofouling a little bit. So currently floats don't really struggle with biofouling, and particularly for sensors that are in the pumped flow stream because of the biocides in the CTD. But sensors outside are prone to biofouling, and also if we somehow get more energy in this, we can start doing higher frequency profiles, then trying to figure out a way to combat biofouling is going to be a significant problem, or potentially. And then so we discussed some potential technologies such as coating and UV LEDs, but none of them really are scalable yet. Sensor technology, one question that came up is the beam attenuation sensors. So the biological pump group mentioned this too, and we were also kind of wondering, they exist and they're available, and then why aren't they more common on floats? And then so we thought it was because of the energy demand and also the bulkiness of the sensor, but something that we could think about. There were other questions about how the active acoustics and microstructures, wet chemistry on a float and things like that. And then it always kind of came down to energy and reliability. And so in my mind, there's a difference between a float that has a biogeochemical sensor on it versus a BGC Argo float. So one-offs that just a sensor on a float is fine, and you can do it in an individual group. But there's a completely different challenge when you need to scale from that individual prototype to the a global program such as BGC Argo. And so one big problem is this valley of death concept of the funding available to make that transition. So there's funding available to make prototype sensors, and then funding to kind of once it becomes commercially available, but to bridge those two gaps to make a prototype reliable and scalable for a program like BGC Argo. Funding is lacking, and that's something that is a huge challenge and something that we kind of need to address, and is a bottleneck for making sensors available for profiling floats and any technology in general. So that's all I had.
All right, thanks, Yui. Any questions for the sensor group, technology group? All
Is there any
right.
data on the energy use by the transmissometers? Because I wasn't aware that the energy use was significantly more than the other BGC sensors.
Yeah, we mentioned, so the nitrate sensor was an example of a pretty power hungry sensor, so, but yeah, I'm not sure. I never dealt with that. So if someone has experience.
This is Ian Walsh. It's about the same. It may be even less for the transmissometer. The problem with the transmissometer is you've got two optical faces to FAL rather than just one for the backscattering sensor.
Yeah, Yui, I think the main problem with transmissometers has been long-term operation of them. They end up fouling. Stuff accumulates enough on the flat optical surfaces that they lose their transmission.
Great to know. Thanks.
Awesome. So next up, marine food webs.
Oh my gosh. Okay, that's me. So it was a small group, five of us, and we had a range of interests from fisheries to physics and modeling. I had a list of questions to prompt the discussion. What level of trophic resolution do you need? And the answer really could be depends on what you're doing. And the most interesting comment I think we got there was that from the modeling groups, they want a trophic resolution, phytoplankton functional groups or zooplankton that match the model they run. But there are models with all kinds of different, resolutions, and models that have functional groups, models that model, the whole ecosystem in terms of size distribution. So, that really didn't limit the number of sensors. We actually then talked about the kind of sensors that might be available, treading on UE's territory, the sensors that might get us to higher trophic levels, acoustic backscatter. There fair bit of discussion about the value of just having a backscatter sensor and whether, how you interpret the data. Wasn't overwhelming support for that. There was a lot of interest in having information on size distributions, and we talked a fair bit about UVPs, underwater vision profilers on floats. I made the comment, I don't think any of the sensors are going to give us genus and species, but what we do get towards our size distributions, and the UVP seems to be fairly efficient at that. There are UVPs running on floats now. I don't know, I would say half a dozen floats, something in the water. We talked about better FLBB sensors that give us wavelength resolution for the fluorescence excitation. That would be a good way to start to get to phytoplankton functional groups and distinguish pigment types and really then say something about the classes of phytoplankton that are present. We talked a bit about high resolution radiometers. So the radiometer that Christina talked about, very, very successful, only gives you 4 wavelengths. But there are now radiometers out there that get, a hyperspectral that get you to sort of 1 nanometer resolution. And to the extent that the float is, gives you the extinction coefficients at a whole variety of wavelengths, you can really start to get a water column absorption spectrum, and again start to get to functional groups of plankton based on pigments. We talked very briefly about genomics and environmental DNA, a big thing. It is very clear that at this stage of the game, that would be a float that would need to be retrieved and returned back to shore, but might be very valuable for a process study as opposed to a global array, but a float that would collect and preserve DNA and operate till it was recovered by a research ship could be very valuable. There was some skepticism of that, but we discussed it, and again, we talked about what a marine food web from the model perspective, and really one of the goals of BGC Argo is to get the data assimilated by a model. The models really define the marine food web resolution that we need. One of the discussions, again, related to UE sensors, but food web were the prospects for small-scale customization of floats with experimental sensors. And we made the point that there are really two trends in the manufacturing community. Manufacturers moving towards a very standardized set of floats and maybe not doing a lot of experimental work and not, wanting to take, one new sensor and integrate it to a float, versus maybe there will be a market for a commercial entity that focuses on incorporating experimental sensors, small numbers of sensors in floats. And I think that might be it. Small group, and when I asked about our experience in food webs, I was the first one that said I don't know anything about them, and I won't say that the rest of the group exactly supported that, but there probably was room for more food web expertise in the room. Thank you. That's it. Questions?
Thanks, Ken.
One comment on the particle size distribution. In principle, with enough data, the height of the spikes, it should be correlated to the size, and so the distribution of heights of spikes. I'm going to be trying to work on validating this using UVP data, but it should be able to get you a very crude particle size distribution from about 100 microns up to about 2 millimeters.
Thank you, Nathan. And we also made the point that, as you've shown, we can, in terms of food web structure, we can now kind of get to at least two sizes of particles, small and big. But getting beyond that, I think will require that kind of work you're talking about, or an instrument like a UVP, which is all great.
Hi, I had a question. I heard talking about the hyperspectral radiometry in both our groups, the instruments, and this one. I was wondering, maybe people see this easier than I see it, but it seems to me that it would be mostly to get to the absorption spectrum. And I don't think that operation is as simple. It's done generally with an ACS, but like the KD includes a lot of, like, the dissolved signal seems to me it will be overwhelming for most cases. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's another something that I'm missing.
Well, so Benedetto, I can only, way more than I do. So number one, there are colleagues, I know that Hervé Claustra's group, Argo in Germany, are deploying floats with hyperspectral radiometers on them. Hervé seemed fairly excited about the data when he was showing me, and maybe Nathan, more, or Antoine Poteau is on the call. Hervé seemed pretty jazzed about it, but I know, I don't know anything. Sorry to say. I don't know, Antoine or Nathan?
Yeah, we do deploy also floats with trios radiometers, like German people, and it's working very, very great. I do retweet the tweet just now, so you can have a look.
Yeah, I think that what you can do with the hyperspectral radiometer, what you can leverage is the fact that dissolved matter, even though it absorbs a lot, absorbs at a very smooth sort of exponential function, whereas the phytoplankton pigments are sharply peaked. So you can look at the sort of fine scale structure in the KD spectrum. And some people even do this with absorption spectra. You look at the fourth order derivative of the spectrum with respect to wavelength, and you get these peaks that correspond to these different pigments. So I do think there's certainly an extra processing step versus phytoplankton absorption spectra, but I think most of the information is in there if we extract it. But it will be a lot of work and research to do that well.
So
Maybe some
yes,
machine learning applications to getting that signal out. I think we probably should move on to the next group to keep on schedule, but very cool discussion. Next up is the modeling and prediction.
There. Yeah, so we had about 10 people in the group and had a good discussion. It was focused sort of on two main themes. The first was needs and requirements, and the second one was benefits. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about needs and requirements. And by that, we mean both with regard to float array and sensors, but also with regard to the models. So the first question we sort of pondered was, do we need more accurate sensors or a broader suite of parameters if we had to choose? And we did not come to a conclusive answer on that. We sort of talked about multiple wavelengths for backscatter, a second carbon system parameter, and then sort of more generally about the need to understand sensor errors and the need to distinguish there between noise and offsets or biases. So the sense is that noise is something we can deal with sort of more easily. It's the biases that are important, really important to get a handle on. And then sort of, and this is probably the most concrete sort of outcome of the first part of our discussion. We talked about the desire to have a sort of universal observation operator. So data assimilation nerds will know this as capital H. But really what it means is it's sort of how you relate the observations to your model state. Because the floats obviously don't measure exactly what the model represents. And so we talked about the value that sort of best practices would have if we had best practices for relating the float observations to the model variables. That would really be useful because there are a lot of subtleties, right? We've talked about many of them yesterday and today already. And so, you know, not every modeling group necessarily will become expert in Argo float data QC. So having best practices and coordination in the modeling community would really be useful, we think, and attainable. So I think that's a very useful outcome of this discussion. We talked about sort of vertical resolution and the fact that models tend to actually lag behind the floats in that regard, right? The models tend to be much coarser resolution in the vertical. So there's a bit of a challenge for the modeling community. We also did talk about OSSIs very briefly. And so the point maybe to relay back to you is that, so of course the modeling community is quite keen and happy to help with that, but it's important to sort of share this caveat that the results of an OSSI will only be reliable to the degree that the baseline model, it's also called the nature run, captures the true variability in the ocean. And most models underestimate true variability. And that means that sort of the results of an OSSI will be compromised by that. So sort of a note of caution about the OSSIs. And then we moved on to talking about benefits a bit. And so, sort of the obvious priority is that here in short notice, there should be better and better biogeochemical fields available, sort of following the example of core Argo. Will be getting better and better fields of biogeochemical variables and model reanalyses too that reflect that. So sort of there's a whole sequence of sort of immediate benefits for the modeling community that BGC Argo is providing and will provide. Opportunities for evaluating and validating models, like to a degree that we could not before. Improving models by optimizing poorly known model parameters. Testing and improving model parameterizations. And producing more realistic model states via data assimilation. And so already with this relatively spare BGC Argo array that we have, we're getting better information about the covariances between biogeochemical and physical properties. So the relationships in the subsurface in particular, where they are relatively stable, right? So relationships between nitrate and density, for example, in the subsurface don't vary that much, and having that information is really useful. And it'll help overcome some of these issues that we heard about negative impacts of physical data assimilation on biogeochemical fields. If we know how they co-vary physical and biogeochemical fields, we'll be better able to, we'll actually be able to take advantage of that. And the high resolution of the float measurements will inform us about sort of important processes that the models are missing. So think Fei Chai's example about the typhoon impact. And another sort of immediate benefit is that they will these observations will provide better boundary conditions for regional models. And so maybe the last thing I'll say is that one recurring theme was that biogeochemical observations from Argo will inform us about shortcomings that we have in the physics of the models. And in turn, if we are getting better and better covariances between the physics and the biogeochemical properties, improvements in the physics will also help improve the biogeochemistry more. So it's really, it's going to have dual benefit. And yeah, so then the final thing I'll say is that we'll get improved global and regional fields and improved models, and everyone is excited about that. And if anybody from the group wants to add, maybe there's time, I don't know.
Thanks. Any questions? Okay, so the next group up is ocean acidification.
Yeah, so our group was small, 4 of us, was led by Andrea Fassbender. And we clarified some questions about how to apply for the funding through NSF and NOAA. And then we talk a little bit about the pH sensor and the quality of the data, kind of like Andrea was saying that the pH measurements were, and also I think that Ken also mentioned that the pH sensor is very robust, but they have some problems with the O-rings. And we also clarify some questions about how the data is validated using oxygen and nitrate. We talked about the uncertainties of the PCO2 from pH measurements. We talked about the biases due to maybe organic alkalinity and the dissociation constants. We also share a paper or like a working group that is going to be working with identifying these uncertainties in the CO2 measurements and the carbonate chemistry and the organic base concentrations and the CO2 system calculations. So there is a group in OCB that is going to work with that. We talk also about how to use these floats. One of the participants was thinking in using these floats in a supplemental of the North Atlantic biogeochemical fluxes and the rapid array. I also was interested in using maybe these floats in the Caribbean regions to see kind of like the hurricanes effects in carbonate chemistry. We were all kind of new and kind of learning from this workshop about application of the floats. Use the map CO2 data to kind of like compare with the Argo floats from PMEL. We also talk about how this Argo floats and increasing the data in the West Africa can also help answer some questions in that region. We talked about the validation of the pH measurements and all the carbon and chemistry parameters. Share a paper from Carter about how this data is validated. We talk a little bit about frequency of the sensors and how can we maybe, the flexibility of changing this frequency to see processes or specific questions. I think that was basically it. But if I missed something from the group, feel free to jump in. And if you have questions.
Great, thank you. Any questions? Okay, so oxygen cycling OMZs next.
Okay, hi. In our group, we had around 5 or 6 people with a bunch of different interests in the oxygen sensors, either for the study of oxygen minimum zones or for using the oxygen data to constrain ventilation or use the data for boundary conditions in models. We talked a lot about the quality control aspects of the data and like different ways that you can validate or calibrate the sensor and how it kind of varies between the different float models. We also talked about using Argo data to study the different diel cycling in different regions of the ocean and kind of what frequency of cycling you would need to kind of get the data you need to understand the processes that you're looking at. Yeah, those are most of the notes that I have, but if I miss anything, anybody from our group can feel free to chime in, or if you have any questions.
All right, thanks, Alan. We can, I think, move on to our last report out, which is the synergy with remote sensing and satellite data.
Hi, everyone. So we had a very small group too. It was just myself, Emily, and Jackie from Mbari. And so not a lot of technical strength around some of the issues that I'm sure everyone's interested in. Obviously, there's a huge synergy between the physics, physical missions like sea level, sea surface salinity, surface temperature with core Argo, but the additional synergies with ocean color missions we talked about mostly. And obviously there's going to be a lot of exciting science that will come out of seeing aerosol plumes and ocean blooms and being able to go look at the float data. I guess one of the questions we really thought about or talked a bit about was that the synergy will go up once more floats have irradiance radiometers on them, and so that's still a ways away. And so we just thought that with PACE being delayed, which is going to fly a hyperspectral instrument, so once PACE is up, we'll be able to have a lot more synergies between that and the radiometers that will hopefully get out in the ocean. One question we thought about a bit was the value and frequency of matchups. So is there a huge amount of value in trying to do something special to drive up the times that floats might profile within 2 hours of an overpass of a satellite? And we wondered whether anyone had done the calculation that if we did nothing, just ran the floats, 1,000 floats on a random 10-day cycle, what would that mean if as far as accumulating matchups for the different missions with cloudiness and things taken into account. And if it's very valuable, we could contemplate either having special floats aimed at doing matchups or some portion looking at trying to increase the frequency that we get matchups, because that would help not only track the stability of the float radiometers and optical sensors, but it could also help us understand something about the atmospheric corrections, or the how good the atmospheric corrections are for the satellite sensors. And the other topic we talked a bit about was, as more radiometers get out on floats, should we be doing more as far as shipboard sampling when the floats are deployed? And discussed a bit about whether trying to get flow cytometry done during that time, so we understand a bit more about species composition. And Emily and Jackie, please speak up if there's any more that you bring to the group.
You did a great job, Susan, for not being a technical expert in this particular field.
Thank you. All right, that's all we have.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. So thank you everyone today. I really enjoyed all the discussion and all the presentations. We're looking forward to the third day tomorrow.